So I'm going to try to tell you why I have arrived at the conclusion that psychiatry does more harm than good. It's the only specialty in medicine that I know about that does this. And this is because of the huge use of psychiatric drugs. So I'm going to first tell you about how many people are killed by psychiatric drugs. And already this is difficult to find out. And here are some of the major problems in psychiatric randomized trials, that usually patients are already in treatment before they get randomized to a new similar treatment or placebo, sometimes after a washout period, which is too short to avoid cold turkey symptoms in some patients, which is what we call withdrawal symptoms or abstinence symptoms. And what that means is that you harm some patients in the placebo group, and then you conclude that you have a treatment that is better than when you have harmed some patients in the placebo group. But that's not what the drug companies tell you. They tell you we have a good drug that is better than placebo. They forget about the harm they have introduced. This is one of the big biases in psychiatric drug trials. Another big one is that there is no effective blinding in these trials because the drugs have conspicuous side effects. And since the outcomes are subjective, measured on various scales, we know that when the treatments have not been adequately blinded, the assessment of the outcomes will be biased in favor of drug. So this is another very important bias. And then the third bias is that events after the randomized trial is over are ignored. And why is it important to include these events? Because what happens after the randomized phase is over is typically that more adverse events appear in the treatment group than in the placebo group. And why? Because sometimes people stop taking a drug in the active group, so then they can develop withdrawal symptoms. And these symptoms can be sometimes very harmful. One of the worst is akathisia, which is Greek and means I cannot sit still. So people can walk around frantically, and it's a horrible condition which predisposes to both suicide, violence, and in the worst case, homicide. People don't usually realize that it's a side effect. They think that they have gone mad, and therefore they kill themselves because it's unendurable by some of them. It's a very severe adverse effect. There are many other withdrawal effects. They can be psychosis, they can be depression, they can be all sorts of things. And during the randomized trial, the psychiatrists are very keen to keep the patients on the drug or on the placebo. But this is not what happens in clinical practice. When people experience side effects, particularly sexual side effects, which are very common with psychiatric drugs, they might deliberately introduce a pause where they don't take drugs because they want to have sex again. And if they do that, many will develop withdrawal symptoms. They might also forget their pills on a weekend or just for school or university if you study medicine. And drugs with a short half-life, like paroxetine, already if you miss one pill, people can sometimes develop severe abstinence symptoms. Just one single pill. It is like this. This has been documented. So if you add these events after the randomized trial was over, you will more accurately tell people what happens in real life outside randomized trials. And this is quite different. So now you have the three major flaws in psychiatric drug trials, which make it difficult to find out how lethal these drugs are. And then we have the problem that by far most trials are conducted by the drug industry. We know that there are many missing deaths in trial reports. And we also know, as I said, that these abstinence symptoms increases death. This has been documented. And I apologize for, well, I don't need to apologize really, but sometimes people think, oh, the guy just referred to his own book. It's unscientific. It's not. I mean, I have hundreds of references in my book. I can't show all them in a slide. So you have to bear with me. My documentation is in my book, most of it. Because you don't, I'm also a biologist. If you're going to describe how humans develop from fish, you can't just show it on 3 slides with 3 references. I mean, this is hundreds of references. It's the same with psychiatry. It takes many years before you realize the bottom of the problems. Now, missing deaths in published trials has been studied systematically in 142 trials by comparing what was published with trial registers. And what they found was that half of the deaths and half of the suicides, they were simply missing. So therefore, it's impossible for psychiatrists to know how dangerous their drugs are when they read trial reports, when half of the deaths are gone. That's pretty obvious. And you see the drugs were olanzapine, a neuroleptic, and another neuroleptic, and a third one, and a stimulant, and 2 depression pills. It's all over the place like this. Now, one of my colleagues, science journalist Bob Whittaker, has published a very interesting book, Made in America, and another one, Anatomy of an Epidemic. And he has shown that in trials of neuroleptics, where people were randomized to placebo, this cold turkey phenomenon increases death. 1 in every 145 patients died in these trials. None of the deaths were mentioned in the scientific literature, and the Food and Drug Administration didn't even require them to be mentioned. Half of the deaths were suicides. And the suicide rate in the trials was 2 to 5 times higher than usually for patients with schizophrenia. So there you have a documentation that these designs are dangerous and they are actually lethal. And yet they are still used. If I want to find out how dangerous neuroleptics are, I cannot use the trials in schizophrenia because the placebo patients were exposed to cold turkey. So I thought, now I go to the old ones, the demented people, because a good deal of them were likely not already in treatment before they were randomized. So I thought I would get better results by looking at the old people. And there is a meta-analysis of these demented people of 4 neuroleptics. And what you can see, it was published in JAMA. Out of every 100 patients treated, you kill 1 of them, 1% difference. And these are short-term trials, just 2.5 months. Now, you have just learned that half of the deaths are missing. And look how beautiful it is. If you go to the Food and Drug Administration and look at similar trials, then the difference is 2%. That's double as much. And what if we go out in clinical practice? Well, it becomes more uncertain because then it's no longer randomized trials. But let's have a look at it. In a Finnish register study, in 70,000 people with dementia, now there were 5 deaths per 100 person years, so that's more than 10 weeks. It's a full year. And of course, the death rate increased with polypharmacy. The more drugs the patients received, the worse it was. So they do kill many people, and yet you can read a lot of reports in the scientific literature, including in the Lancet, by a Finnish guy and other people telling you, oh no, these drugs protect against death. Don't believe them. It's ludicrous. They use unreliable observational studies to get their point across that these drugs save lives. They don't. They kill. It's as simple as that. And you can just look at the randomized trials, and then you will see, yes, they actually kill people. So what about lithium? This is a drug I studied with a Swedish psychiatrist recently. This is a drug that psychiatrists are usually very proud of. There are 24 placebo-controlled trials in mood disorders. It seems to reduce suicide. That's why psychiatrists are proud of this drug. But the trials were very small, and there were only 1 versus 6 suicides in all these 24 trials. And some of these trials, most of them suffered from cold turkey problems, which might induce suicides in the placebo group. And the authors themselves pointed out that only 1 or 2 moderately sized trials with neutral or negative results could materially affect the estimates. Of course, 0 versus 6 is very uncertain. And total death, there seemed to be an effect on total death, but with wide confidence intervals. So what we did was that we looked at trials that did not have cold turkey phenomenon. So we only included trials where patients were not already on lithium. There were only 5 trials that had data on death. And what we found was 2 versus 9. So it seemed that, okay, lithium protects against death. Suicides, 0 versus 3. That's, of course, not statistically significant. But still, our conclusion was that there is no reliable evidence that lithium decreases total mortality or suicides. And why did we conclude that when there was a significant effect on total mortality? Because there is a lot of reporting bias. As you already learned twice now, half of the deaths and suicides are simply missing in psychiatric drug trials. So what can we conclude based on such small numbers? I wouldn't conclude anything for certain based on that. That's the way I was educated. You need to be more careful than that. Then the benzodiazepines. Everybody hates these drugs nowadays, but people should hate depression drugs in the same way. One of my PhD students did a PhD that compared the 2 drug classes, and the abstinence symptoms are very much the same. People get dependent on depression pills like they get dependent on benzodiazepines. They do, and many people have difficulty stopping them again. It's a fact. So people shouldn't be so happy with happy pills. Now, the benzos, I can't really use randomized trials. I didn't find anything, so I used a big UK cohort study, and of course increased doses increased mortality. The drugs doubled the death rate. The excess death rate was 1% per year. Then there is a not so good US cohort study that found that these pills kill a lot of Americans every year. I don't know if this is correct, but that's a huge amount of people. Anyway, well, let me just finish the depression pills. Why do they kill people? Well, one of the mechanisms you will see on the next slide when I look at depression pills, why do they kill people? Well, here is a cohort study, a very good one, again from the UK, of people at least 65, and the excess death rate was about 3% per year. That's very large. And they double the risk of falls and hip fractures in a dose-dependent manner. And when you break your hip, 20% will be dead within the next year. So that's one of the mechanisms. It's very easy for an orthopedic surgeon to repair your hip, but 1/5 of the patients will die anyhow. So I have corresponded with the first author, Copeland, and I felt this was a bit much. But in one of